Today, Riot revealed yet more cards from the upcoming Empires of the Ascended expansion for Legends of Runeterra, and there is a lot to cover, including some references or callbacks to other cards that were revealed. There's like an entirely new archetype that was revealed, and I have to say, after yesterday's card reveals, when I was filming the video, I really thought we were going to see Zilean today because we had so many time-centric revealed cards yesterday, and Zilean was in the background art of some of them, but we got Taliyah. And first, I'm just gonna describe level 1 Taliyah because that leads into everything else with this reveal. And again, it kind of reveals that there's a brand new archetype that they are trying to promote with this champion. So Taliyah is a 5-cost 2/4 champion, and on play, she summons an exact copy of an allied landmark. She levels up when you've summoned 5+ landmarks. So before we talk about level 2 or any of the other cards revealed, you should know right out of the gate, this is a brand new archetype. Why? Well, landmarks in Legends of Runeterra up to this point they've been good cards, and they are the kind of cards that you can build a deck around. You think about like a Grand Plaza deck, for example, but they're traditionally a value generator. So you play it, it gives you some sort of passive effect or passive value generation. Temple's another good example of doing that. And then it sits on the board and you get some benefit from it, and that's that. But you traditionally in your decks, you're only picking one of these landmarks because you don't want to take up the room in your deck that could be other cards, because the landmarks just sit there and they do passive things. They also take up a slot on the board, so you don't go heavy landmarks. Now Taliyah here very clearly wants you to go heavy landmarks, and I think the way they introduce landmarks for her package is a very interesting way to do so. We're going to see more of that, but I just wanted to say that I love that they just throw a champion at you and they're like, yep, this is going to be an archetype now, and it subverts expectations. All right, so level 2 of Taliyah, if you do summon 5 or more landmarks in a game, she gets the standard +1/+1, so she becomes a 5-cost 3/5. She still has the exact same play effect where you copy a allied landmark. Now, it is worth noting the text here says exact copy, which leads you to believe that if you have a allied landmark with that countdown keyword, it will copy it at whatever the countdown number is. Similarly, if you play the landmark buff card that we saw revealed in a previous reveal video, it should copy that buff as well. This says exact copy of an allied landmark. She gains at level 2 on attack, deal 2 to my blocker. If it's dead or gone, deal 2 to the enemy nexus instead. And if you have a landmark, do this 2 more times. So casually swinging for 9 if unblocked, and has a good chance of, you know, mowing down whatever the blocker is before they get the chance to strike her. And then, you know, if it's like a 1/1 chump blocker, you're still getting some damage through in the form of her skill. So this is a very worthwhile level up effect for a champion, right? Like the payoff here is potentially worth it because she becomes a very effective finisher. Like this is a very good on attack ability here. So that's level 1 and level 2. Her champion spell, which will again also be like a regular spell in the game, it'll be called Stone Weaving, but it's Taliyah's Stone Weaving. This is a 1-cost burst spell. It says look at 3 random landmarks you can afford, pick 1 to create in hand. Now this is interesting because I want to know the answers to a few questions because it's going to dictate how you play this card. So first and foremost, random isn't always truly random in Legends of Runeterra. Sometimes random is just pulling from your own regions. Sometimes it pulls from all regions. Traditionally, whether it's one or the other, it's usually called out on a card, like Burblefish says your regions, and the Demacian Last Breath card says all regions or other regions, etc. So I want to know, is this just going to be landmarks from the regions of your deck, or is it truly random? The other thing I want to know is what it means when it says you can afford, because this very clearly is going to be talking about mana, but it could be talking about mana in one of 2 different ways. The first way, and it's the one that I think is most likely would be your max mana. So if you play this on round 5, this should be showing you landmarks that cost 5 or less. But it could also mean whatever you could afford at that moment, theoretically. So it could be round 5, but if you've already played a 2-drop and then you play Stone Weaving, maybe it only shows you landmarks that cost 2 or less. And that matters because that's going to dictate when and how you play this card, because I assume once you get used to playing a Taliyah deck, you're going to know what the important landmarks are for your deck, and you're going to want to increase your chances of finding them, and you're going to know what their cost is. And so that also means you're going to try to target playing Stone Weaving on turns that would increase your chances of being shown those landmarks. So let's just say hypothetically there's a 4-cost landmark that's really important to you. If it's the first way of choosing random landmarks to show you, so based on your max mana, that means you would want to play this on turn 4 to increase your chances of finding that 4-cost landmark. The longer you go, the wider your pool gets. At turn 4, you'll only get 4 and less. At turn 5, it's 5 and less, 6 and less, etc. Meaning that the pool gets more diluted in terms of finding the landmark you want. Now, if it's the second way of determining how you can afford a landmark, and it's based on current mana, not max mana, well, then you have to play this game of math where you are trying to spend mana and play cards to get to your target value to maximize your chances of finding the landmark you want. So it'll take some testing, or maybe we'll just get some confirmation from a Riot dev one way or the other. But it's just important to note, because again, whichever way it does the calculation, that will kind of dictate how you want to approach playing this card. But it wasn't just Taliyah that we got to see. So we're going to go ahead and go to the next graphic I have here. Now, all of these cards kind of support this new archetype where landmarks matter, and a lot of them interact with each other, or some of these are tokens created by other cards. So I'm going to try to talk about them in groups. But right out of the gate, there's a card that is just kind of standalone part of the archetype, and that's Shaped Stone. This is a 1-cost burst spell. You give an ally +1/+1 this round, so it's basically Radiant Strike, but with upside, because this says if you've summoned a landmark this game, give it +3/+1 instead. That is kind of nutty. Like, that is a very good combat trick, because Radiant Strike has been good enough in the past to see play. And as far as the aggressive decks go, the Elixir, I believe it's Elixir of Rage, but I might be wrong, but it's a 1-cost Noxus spell that gives +3/+0. I have seen that see play in the past as well. So this potentially being a combination of the two could very well be good enough to see play. Like, this is a very cost-effective combat trick. So next up out of the revealed cards is another kind of standalone card. This is Size Scout. This is a 3-cost 2/4. On play, you predict, so that's that keyword that was previously revealed where you're shown 3 cards and you pick one to put on top. And this one says, if you pick a landmark, grant me elusive. Now, it's important to note this one says specifically pick a landmark, not that you have to see a landmark. Yesterday, the Kahiri chap, his text said you only have to see him while predicting to get his benefit. So here you have to pick a landmark, but a 2/4 elusive is pretty solid. Like, that is a healthy elusive, and at 3 mana, that's very relevant, because a lot of your elusives right now, you think about like Zap. This trades with Zap and it's cheaper, and you still got the predict effect as well. Burblefish, I mean, let's be honest, by the time you're playing Burblefish, that thing's going to cost 0. But that's a 3/1, and this is still a 2/4. If it gets the elusive, that is very relevant. Like, the stat line on this plus the elusive keyword, not saying you hit it every time, but in this archetype, I would assume that you're going to have a pretty high probability. This feels like a pretty worthwhile card. Moving on to the other revealed cards, we have Rockhopper next. This is one of 2 cards that interact with a new token that gets created. Rockhopper is a 2-cost 3/1. And when I'm summoned, you summon a Roiling Sands. What is a Roiling Sands, you ask? Well, that's the card in the upper right here. It's a landmark, and it says, when an enemy is summoned, destroy me to grant it vulnerable. So that's pretty neat because this is a 3/1 that gives a future enemy vulnerable. And it's interesting because it is a effect that potentially impacts play patterns of your opponent. It's not as powerful as being able to choose what you give vulnerable, right? Like that is a drawback, but it also means that if your opponent wanted to play something on curve, but they don't want it to have vulnerable, perhaps they now have to wait a turn or two until they can play a 1 or a 2 drop beforehand to eat up the Roiling Sands and then play the card that they want to protect. It's also worth noting that this grants enemies vulnerable, and that matters very much for cards like Renekton that we've already seen, who wants to challenge other units but doesn't have Challenger himself. So this could fit into the Taliyah archetype, but this also could fit into like a Renekton archetype. It is a multi-purpose card, and I dig that. I like the overlap. Speaking of Roiling Sands, the other card that deals with it that was revealed is Unraveled Earth. This is a 3-cost burst spell. It says summon 2 Roiling Sands and draw 1. And this feels potentially pretty good. If it didn't say draw 1, I would not have the same positive outlook. But the fact that this cycles, the fact that it costs 3 or less, so it's within your spell mana threshold, and the fact that this also summons 2 Roiling Sands, which again could alter the play patterns of your opponent, could give key units vulnerable, could help further deck archetypes like Renekton if you want to charge into things. I feel like this is a very cost-effective card for annoying your opponent because it replaces itself, and it just makes them consider what they're playing and how to play around your Roiling Sands. Is it going to be good enough to see play? I don't know. Obviously, being able to grant enemy units vulnerable is very powerful, but you don't get to choose which ones this grants. They can alter their play patterns to deny that because it is an enemy summoned. So, you know, you could play Roiling Sands and then somebody could rummage away 2 jury rigs, and that's what gets the vulnerable, right? There's ways to properly dodge this, I feel, but it still forces your opponent to deal with it. It's still annoying. So I think I'm a fan of this card in theory, but it's one that I think is going to take some testing to decide if it's good enough, if that makes sense. All right. Next up, we're going to start what I call the Grumpy Rock Bear Trio. So there's going to be 3 cards that deal with this new token, which is Grumpy Rock Bear. Grumpy Rock Bear, just to get it out of the way, is a 5-cost 5/4. So it's just a 5/4 with no keywords or anything. But these next 3 cards are going to reference said Grumpy Rock Bear, so I wanted to preface with that. So first up, we have Desert Naturalist. This is a 4-cost 2/4. On play, you destroy a landmark. If it's an allied landmark, summon a Grumpy Rock Bear. So this is interesting because it's versatile. You can destroy your own landmark to get some sort of positive benefit, or you could destroy an opposing landmark. If we start to see these landmark archetypes pop up, it gives you that bit of flexibility. But also, you know, if you have a landmark and it's just taking up space, or maybe you don't want to wait for your Roiling Sands to give you a benefit on turn 4, right on curve, paying 4 mana to get a 2/4 and a 4/5 feels pretty good. Like, that's a lot of stats for 4 mana. So, you know, if you do something like Rock Hopper into Desert Naturalist, you could get a healthy amount of stats. Next up, we have Salt Spire. This is a 4-cost landmark, has a countdown of 2, and you summon a Grumpy Rock Bear with the countdown effect. Then, if you've summoned 4 or more landmarks this game, you grant the strongest ally +2/+2. So you get a 5/4, and then you get +2/+2 on whatever your strongest ally is, which, you know, depending on the state of the game, that very well could still just be the Grumpy Rock Bear that you're summoning, but it could be something else. This is, however, in my opinion, a potential candidate for the kind of landmark that you would want to use that buff spell on. Because this at least costs 4, and so if you're spending then 4 mana to copy it, it's the same as playing a second to double the effect. I still don't think that this is the landmark that they have in mind when they designed that card for the big payoff, but I don't know, maybe this is it. I suppose if you play Salt Spire and then you also play the spell on it, and then you play Taliyah to copy Salt Spire, so that you're now in a position where you're creating, you know, 4 Grumpy Rock Bears and giving +2/+2 4 times. You know, that could be splashy, but really this is just a, you know, you like Grumpy Rock Bears, and sometimes they get big. Speaking of Grumpy Rock Bears, we also have Hibernating Rock Bear. This is another landmark. This is a 2 cost, and it says countdown of 3, summon a Grumpy Rock Bear. So you play it on turn 2, 3 turns later, you get a 5/4, but you only invested the 2 mana to get there. So again, fine. Now the interesting thing is both of these summon a Grumpy Rock Bear just like by default. So they're also natural targets for the Desert Naturalist, pun intended, meaning that if you play the Desert Naturalist, you're really still getting the same value you would have from the landmarks, but you're just speeding up your return on investment, right? So if you play Hibernating Rock Bear on 2 and you play Naturalist on 4, you still end up with the exact same net result you were getting from your landmark. You're just getting it a turn sooner. So, you know, on turn 4, giving yourself again a 5/4 and a 2/4 body, that's pretty good. So overall, I think that there is some potential here. It's a lot of raw stats, but not a lot in the way of keywords. But it is also worth noting Grumpy Rock Bear has 5 attack power, so it could fit into the 5 attack power matters style decks of Noxus, for example. This could be a great way to activate Reckoning or similar effects. I don't know if it's going to end up being good enough just because of the lack of keywords, though. We'll have to see what the rest of the package is. So the last thing I want to cover is what I think potentially is the most powerful card of the ones that were revealed in this batch. So this is Ancient Hourglass. This is a 2 cost fast spell. You obliterate an ally and summon a stasis statue in its place. Stasis statue is shown next to it. This is a 2 cost landmark, but it has a countdown of 1, and you summon an exact copy of the obliterated unit I replaced. Now, I will say that I have some questions about the interactions here in terms of, I don't believe there's recalling landmarks at the moment. Perhaps there is, but if this gets somehow recalled into your hand, does it remember the obliterated unit it replaced even if you replay it later, that sort of thing? But the reason that I think this card is great, the reason I think this is powerful, is this is a very cheap combat trick to potentially save a key unit from death. So somebody tries to vengeance your unit. This isn't outright deny, but you could spend 2 to turn it into a statue and then you get it back next turn. More importantly though, this summons it. So if your unit has any sort of summon effect, if it does something when it comes into play, think like Rekindler, you get that summon effect again. So not only is this a protective combat trick, but this is also potentially an exploitative combat trick. Further, this here is a landmark that you can copy with Taliyah when it's in stasis statue form. So if you use Ancient Hourglass to copy a very impressive unit, and then play Taliyah to make a copy of that, it should then give you like 2 copies of that unit when the countdown ends. And same thing with the 4-cost slow spell that is buffing landmarks. You can apply that here as well. I think that there is more opportunity for interaction and exploitation with this card than any of the other landmark cards I've seen so far. And this is also the one that I think is part of the quote-unquote landmark package that is most likely to appear in non-landmark decks. I think Rockhopper is potentially a candidate in Renekton focused decks because of the granting of vulnerability and still giving you a decent body on turn 2. But this Ancient Hourglass, just being able to save a unit, re-trigger summon effects, I think that that is really neat from a design standpoint, but also really capable of creating some interesting things, because you know, it only took seeing like Gluttony, for example, to make Zombie Anivia make a comeback. So being able to exploit summon effects with something like Ancient Hourglass, it gets my mind going in terms of deck building opportunities. Because again, even if you're just using it as a natural combat trick, like if you save a zap, somebody targets zap with Mystic Shot and you're like, all right, well, I'm going to Hourglass this to save it. Not only do you protect your zap, but you get to draw another card. There's a lot of units that exist in the game that just have really good summon effects on top of them, and this is going to allow you to trigger them again. So I like this card a lot. I think Ancient Hourglass is going to be something to keep an eye on. But that's it. Done with the ranting. Hopefully you are as excited about this set as I am. The more I see from it, the more I like it. I think that this is really fleshing out the rest of the feel for Runeterra long term. It's not just that we're getting yet another region, but this feels like we're finally getting to the point where we're going to be playing Runeterra the way the game was always meant to be played. I love that we finally have landmarks in the game now. I love that this expansion seems to be taking them to a whole new level. I'm just really excited, and I've seen a lot of cards that make me want to deck build, which is, as I've said before, like the greatest compliment that you can give to an upcoming expansion. So anyway, I said I was done. I'm actually done now. Made it this far. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments as always, and I will see you in the next reveal video.